In this video, we are going to talk about the multiplication and division of integers, and also we'll end up doing some algebra using all four operations and integers. So let's start with multiplication of integers. What is negative 2 multiplied by 3? Many people tell me that this answer is equal to a negative 6, and they would certainly be correct. But do you know why that works? Let's look at some patterns, which is really what math is all about, in order to show why negative 2 times 3 has to equal a negative 6. I'm going to write down some problems here. 5 times 3 equals, 4 times 3 equals, and I'm going to continue that pattern just every time reducing that first number by 1, and we'll end up solving all these. Obviously, you know 5 times 3 is 15, 4 times 3 is 12, 3 times 3 is 9, 2 times 3 is 6, 1 times 3 is 3, and 0 times 3 is 0. As I take a look at this, I do have a pattern. The very first number I am just reducing by 1 every single time. The second number in every multiplication problem stays exactly the same. What's happening to the answer or the product? Well, every single time that I reduce the first number by 1, the product goes down by 3. I subtract 3 every single time. Well, all math is a series of patterns. So I'm going to continue with this same pattern. I'm going to reduce the very first number by 1. I'm going to keep the other number the same. Negative 1 times 3. Well, negative 1 times 3, I also have to reduce this by a subtract 3, which means I'm going to have an answer right here of negative 3. If I continue with that same pattern, negative 2 times 3, once again, I'm going to have to reduce this by 3, or subtract 3, so I am going to be getting an answer here of negative 6, which is what we said the answer was before. You probably know, or have heard the rule, if you are multiplying two numbers together, and one of them is a negative number, and the other number is a positive number, then the answer is a negative number. And that is certainly a rule that does work when multiplying two integers together. So what happens if you multiply two negative numbers together? For instance, negative 2 times negative 4. We can use patterns once again to see what this answer is. We just got done saying that negative 2 times 3 is equal to a negative 6. So I'm going to make a pattern of numbers here, and you can see every single time that I do this, I'm keeping exactly the same first number of a negative 2, but I am reducing that second number by 1. So I have negative 2 times negative 3, and finally the negative 2 times negative 4, which is this original problem that we want to solve. We know now that negative 2 times 2 also is now equal to a negative 4, because I have a negative times a positive. There's an understood positive there, which means then that negative 2 times 1 is equal to negative 2. Negative 2 times 0 is equal to 0. Well, what's happening every time? Obviously, as this second number reduces in 1, look what happens to the answer. In this particular case, I'm actually adding 2 to the answer. To get from negative 6 to negative 4, I have to add 2. To get from negative 4 to 2, I have to add 2. To get from 2 to 0, I have to add 2. So I'm going to follow that same pattern right here, which means I'm going to have to add 2 to this, so I get an answer of 2. If I continue this, adding 2 every single time, I'm finally going to come up with negative 2 times negative 4 is equal to positive 8, or we just say 8. So if you have a negative number multiplied by a negative number, that answer is a positive number. So we really have those two different rules. A negative times a negative is equal to a positive, But if you have a positive times a negative, that's equal to a negative. And that works all the time for multiplication. A nice way to say both of these rules then is, if the signs are the same, the answer is always positive. If the signs are different, the answer is always negative. What about the rules for division? Since it is division, are the rules the same, or are they the opposite rules? Well, let's take a look. If we had the problem negative 8 divided by 4 is equal to a question mark, we could change that to a multiplication problem. So we could say whatever the answer is times 4 would have to equal a negative 8. Well, in order for us to get an answer of a negative, if this is a positive number, that must mean that this would have to be a negative number. So negative 2 times 4 would equal negative 8. So if I put negative 2 in for my question mark back in the division problem, negative 8 divided by 4 has to equal a negative 2. So I have a negative number divided by a positive number, and I get a negative answer. So the signs were different. And when the signs are different, I end up getting a negative answer. Let's do the same thing with negative 15 divided by negative 3. I'm going to change that to a multiplication problem. So the answer times negative 3 has to equal a negative 15. Well, for the multiplication rules to work, that must mean that this answer has to be a positive 5, because a positive times a negative gives me the negative for the answer, which must mean that this is equal to 5. So I have negative 15 divided by negative 3 is equal to 5. So once again, I have two signs that are the same, and I get a positive. So the rules for division are exactly the same as the rules for multiplication. It doesn't matter whatsoever. If the signs are the same, I'm always going to get a positive number. If the signs are different, I'm always going to get a negative answer. Now remember, those rules work when you have two numbers that you are multiplying or dividing. What is negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 4? They're all negative numbers. But in order to figure out the answer, first of all, what I have to do is I figure out, well, what's negative 2 times negative 3? Negative 2 times negative 3 would give me 6. 6 times a negative 4 then gives me a negative 24. So even though I start off with a problem and all of the signs were negative, I still got a negative answer because I have an odd number of numbers that I am multiplying together. How about if we have 4 negative numbers that we are multiplying together? In this particular case, the negative times the negative would give you a positive. This negative times this negative would also give you a positive, so a positive times a positive would give me a positive answer. So it is important to realize that it depends upon how many numbers you are multiplying, if they all happen to be negative, whether or not your final answer would be a negative or a positive. If you have an odd number of numbers that you are multiplying, and they are all negative, for instance, in this particular case, you're going to end up with a negative number. If you have an even number of negative numbers that you are multiplying, then you are going to end up with a positive number. Now that we've discussed integers and using all 4 operations with those integers, let's turn to algebra. What is algebra? Algebra means giving values to different symbols, usually letters of the alphabet, and solving problems with those. So we're going to do a little bit of algebra here, but as I say, we'll do it with integers. Let us say that we have some algebra statements saying that x is always equal to negative 1, y is always equal to 3, and z is always equal to negative 4. If I wanted to solve an algebraic expression then, similar to x plus y plus z, all I need to do is put those values in for x, y, and z, and then go through and solve this. So if I do that, I see that x has to equal -1, y has to equal 3, and z has to equal -4. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add all of those together. So going through and doing this, I'm going to do these two numbers at a time. -1 plus 3 is equal to 2. So now I have 2 plus -4, and 2 plus -4 gives me a final answer of -2. Let's do another problem using the same values for x, y, and z. So this time, rather than adding, I want x subtract y subtract z. Once again, I'm just going to be putting in those values. X is equal to a -1, y is equal to 3, and z is equal to -4. But now I am subtracting these. So once again now, I'm going to have to figure out these answers. So first of all, I'm going to do -1 subtract 3. -1 subtract 3 gives me a -4. So now I have -4 subtract another -4. In order to do that, I would probably change this so I have -4, and I would add the opposite of -4, which would be 4. So the final answer to that is equal to 0. Let me do another problem, once again using the same values for x, y, and z. I'm going to write this as 6z plus y. So one of the things that we do need to make sure of is, what does 6z mean? 6z means 6 multiplied by z. But because we are using algebra, it could get very difficult if we put that multiplication sign in there, because then we don't know if it's an x or if it is a multiplication sign. So in algebra, if you see a number followed by a variable z, that means 6 times z. Sometimes you might see a little dot between the two, but normally you don't even see that, and you would just see it written the way I have it, 6z plus y. So once again, we're going to put in that information that we have. We know that z is equal to a -4. So I have 6 times -4, and that's the way I would write it. And there's no sign in between the 6 and the -4, which is an understood multiplication, plus 3. Now I'm going to follow the rules for order of operations. I have to do the multiplication first. So 6 times -4 is equal to a -24. So I have -24 plus 3. And -24 plus 3, using our rules that we talked about, gives me an answer of -21. Here, I have another set of variables up at the top, and you can see what each of the variables is equal to. And then I have an expression, c over 2a plus b. And I want to go through and I want to put in the values. So if I put in the values, it says that c is equal to 5. 2a is equal to 2, so I have 2 times 2. And then it says I want to add a -4. And I want to go through and I want to simplify this. If I go through and simplify this, I have 5 on the top, and on the bottom I have 4 plus a -4. Well, if I go through and simplify that bottom, 4 plus a -4, that gives me 0. So I have an answer here of 5 over 0. So the question is, what does 5 over 0 equal? A lot of people take a look at 5 over 0 and say, well, the answer is 0, and that's not right. And what I'm about to say is very, very important for the rest of this course. 5 divided by 0 is, mathematicians say, an impossibility. Sometimes you could just say it's impossible. Sometimes they might even use the word undefined. 5 divided by 0 is undefined. And you can think of it a couple of different ways. First of all, to divide something by 0 means to divide it and put it into different groups, a different number of groups. Well, how can you put something into 0 groups? You can't. But there's another way also to look at that. And let me just give you one other type of problem before I talk about that. Let's say that you had 8 divided by 2. If I had 8 divided by 2, we know that 8 divided by 2 is equal to 4. And certainly if I wanted to, I could go through and I could change this into a multiplication problem. I could say 4 multiplied by 2 would have to give me 8. Well, it would have to be the same thing with 5 divided by 0. So I would be asking myself, what number, and I'm going to put a question mark there, what number multiplied by 0 would give me 5 for an answer? Well, it's not possible to multiply a number by 0 and get 5 for an answer, which is why we say that anything divided by 0 is undefined. So if you ever see that, make sure if the value of the denominator is equal to 0, there is no possible answer for that. Let me just talk then about one other thing with this. How about if you have 0 divided by 5? Well, 0 divided by 5 does have an answer. Once again, I could put a question mark here and change that into a multiplication. What number times 5 would give me 0? The answer to that is 0. So 0 divided by 5 is equal to 0. If the numerator has a value of 0, the answer is 0. But remember, if the denominator has a value of 0, the answer is undefined. Let me talk about one other time when mathematicians have an answer that is undefined. Let's say that I have the square root of b, and b is equal to -4. So what I'm really saying is, what is the square root of a -4? Remember when we talked about order of operations that square root means what number can you multiply by itself? So I'm going to put this down here. What number can you multiply by itself to get what is in there? What number can you multiply by itself to get a -4? Well, you certainly can't multiply 2 times 2 to get a -4. You also can't multiply a -2 times a -2 to get -4, because a negative times a negative is equal to a positive. So there is no number that you can multiply by itself to get a -4. And for that particular reason, if the value underneath the square root is a negative, this answer is also undefined. And you might see that as we are doing some algebraic problems. You might get something similar to that. So once again, anytime at all that you have a negative number for the final value underneath a square root, your answer is either impossible or undefined. At the end of the second video in this module, I asked you to complete a quick check to gauge your understanding of the concepts in the video, and I would like you to do that again. If you do well on the quick check, you may be ready to take the quiz on this module. There are also additional review problem worksheets and other websites that you can access for more review if you would like, and both the worksheets and links to the websites can be found in this module. You can also contact me for additional help at any time. Thank you.